I'm the Director of Engagement at the Energy Transition Hub, and we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we work and meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and paying our respects to their elders past and present. So thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a turnout to hear today. We not only have clearly a large number of people from across Melbourne, but we also have some of our German hub partners here with us. They've been here working with us for a week or so, and many have gone, but several are still here. As you probably know, the hub is a collaboration between 12 different research institutes, six from Australia and 6 from Germany, so it's very good to have them in the room with us. But today we are here to hear from Michael Wheelahan, the Director of Climate Change Policy at the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Inga Staples-Moon, who is leading the work on the interim emissions reductions targets. So in Victoria, we have a fantastic new Climate Change Act passed in 2017 that sets some very ambitious targets for net zero emissions by 2050, and also maps out a whole range of other initiatives, if you like, to help Victoria transition to a resilient and zero emissions economy. And there are lots of very hardworking and amazing people in Delft trying to work out how that should happen, how we should implement that act, and what measures and policy steps need to be taken. So it's great to have them here today. We have also, hopefully, Stephanie Nile, who is at Delft working on how to mainstream planning for climate change across the Victorian government. So that encompasses a lot of adaptation initiatives and a host of other work. She is running a little late, so she'll be joining us shortly, but I will pass you over to Michael.
All right, thanks very much, Rebecca. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you very much to the Energy Transition Hub for having us here today. It's part of our mission within Delft to do better at telling our story about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So this is a great opportunity to do that. And so thank you for the opportunity to come here and tell our story to you. And thank you to Simon Holmes-A-Court, a Senior Advisor here at the Hub, about suggesting this. You initiated this and here we are. So things can work sometimes, so I appreciate it. I'd like to start by repeating the acknowledgement that Rebecca made to the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people, who are the custodians of this land that we're meeting on. And I also like to reflect on why that's relevant to what we're here to talk about. Because the Wurundjeri and their forebears and the other nations that occupied this land before European settlement, their civilization were custodians of this land for millennia beforehand. And one thing I think is incredible to think about is that their civilization adapted through sea level rise of 110 metres after the last ice age, which isolated Southeast Australia from Tasmania. So they're a great living example of adaptation, not just to the climate, but to the impact of our civilization. And we are all beneficiaries of their dispossession. So when I think about acknowledging them as traditional owners for this land, I like to think about what that means for the topic that we have. I think we have things that we need to learn about how we live in this land and how we manage it, things we need to learn about how they've adapted, and things we need to learn about how civilizations can interact. That's all relevant to climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, and how it unfolds from here. I'm going to start with a great big disclaimer, which here it is. This is something I need to do. And then I'll go back to a little bit about the philosophy of the Act before we get into some detail. So I think you're probably all aware the state government is having an election this Saturday, the 24th of November. Vote early, vote often. Is that the right thing to say? Yeah. Probably not, probably not. But the Victorian government, what that means is we're currently in caretaker mode, okay? So caretaker started at 6 p.m. on the 30th of October, 25 days before the state election. And what that means is that we, the bureaucracy, and the ministers within government are taking care of the executive arm of government while there is no parliament in power in Victoria. So parliament is suspended, dissolved at 6 p.m. on 30th of October. It's gone. There is no parliament to oversee the executive. So the ministers remain the ministers, we remain the bureaucrats, and we need to take care of that function, the executive function of government, while the politics is sorted out and the parliament is sorted out in the electoral process. And it's a special time to be a public servant. It's actually a great time to think about and reflect on what our role is, because our role is to serve the government of the day. And whoever that is after Saturday, that's our job, and we'll do that. What it does mean during this period is that we have to think a bit differently about what we say publicly and what we talk about. And that's really interesting in the context of what we're here to talk about today, because I'm not going to talk about the politics. I'm not going to talk about what one party or another party has to say about climate change in Victoria or federally, when I might have some small room to talk about that on other occasions outside the caretaker period. But there's still an enormous amount that we can talk about, because we've got an Act, and the Act belongs to Parliament. Parliament has passed the Climate Change Act. It's actually a representation of the law in Victoria. And I think this is really key to understand in the context of talking about it, that actually it's not policy necessarily of one party or another, or of one potential government or another. It's actually the law of the state. And so as a representation of the law of the state, we as public servants can come here and talk to you about it, even though it's caretaker. If it were just policy, if we didn't have an Act, things might be different. So that's, I think, a really important point about talking about this in caretaker. You can ask us whatever questions you like. We may not answer them today. That's the other element of this. So if you want to know what I have to say about one party or another, or anyone who's competing in this election about climate change policy, you're welcome to ask, and I'll smile and nod and I'll say, now's not the time, we'll have to go to another question, we're not going to answer that. So be prepared for that. Very welcome to ask. You may not get an answer. So just back to this Climate Change Act thing, as an introductory comment, just to locate it in all of the other stuff that's going on internationally and nationally, I think it's worth thinking about, what has a state got to do in the climate change sphere? What's the role of a subnational government got to do in the climate change sphere when we have an international agreement, the latest being the Paris Agreement on climate change, and it's only nation states that are party to that agreement. So the Australian government, the Commonwealth government, is a party to that agreement. So what's a state doing in this space? It's a rhetorical question. I'm not going to ask anyone to answer it. I'll try and answer it myself. With the challenges and the size of the challenges and the complexity of the challenges of climate change, there is a whole range of ways we could choose to respond as a society, or as a civilization, or as a jurisdiction. And what we've experienced in Australia, and not just Australia, but certainly in other national governments as well, is a bit of stumbling around in terms of getting focused and clear and directed when it comes to climate change policy. And we have in our government culture and our bureaucratic culture a very strong emphasis on efficiency, as you can imagine. And if you want to take an efficient approach, the maximally efficient approach to greenhouse gas emissions reduction, you would probably implement something like an economy-wide carbon price. And that is what a lot of people in bureaucracies, whether they are Victorian bureaucracies, Commonwealth bureaucracy, international bureaucracy, want and think about, because they are trained, and it is our job to think about, how do we do things efficiently? How do we achieve our objectives at least cost, so that we can get on and do all the other things we want to do? So in that context of not having, and I'm not going to go into that for this audience, you know all about that. We had one, we don't have one now. I think that's really important to think about when you think about what's the role for a state. So the timing of this act's really important. 2017, it was after the Paris Agreement. It was conceived of before the Paris Agreement, but with a knowledge of what was going to pan out in that Paris Agreement, or where that was heading. And so the state of Victoria has chosen to get into this space and to have a system of planning for reducing emissions and for adapting to climate change. That is a trend around the world for subnational governments to be involved in this space, to come together themselves and with each other to think about how we're going to do this. So it's really important that we think about that. One of the challenges is in our Australian system that we don't have all of the levers in our hand by any means. They're shared between the states and the Commonwealth. Like in a whole lot of areas, that sharing of power and that distribution of power is very deliberate. So in locating this, I think it's really important to think about the role of the state of Victoria and other subnational jurisdictions in doing this, because this is novel. To have a comprehensive plan for reducing emissions and for adapting to climate change in this way is quite novel. And I have to remind myself that sometimes when I'm sitting at my desk, that's part of the reason why this work is hard. It hasn't necessarily been done before. We have a high-level framework act, and you know what? We're trying to figure it out. So we're going to tell you a bit about that framework. And one thing I'd like people to think about in here as we go through this is, what does this mean for you if you're part of the research community or the policy community or the advocacy community or the business community? What does this mean for you? We've got different parts of government all working on this. We've got us at the centre of this trying to coordinate and think through how do we do this emissions reduction at a state level? How do we do this adaptation at a state level? So I'd like you to think about, and that might be the basis for some questions, how might you work with other parts of the government who are actually trying to do this work? The last thing I'll say about the Act overall is one of the key ideas in it, and this is an important idea, and Stephanie will talk a little bit more about this later on. One of the ideas in it is that, to use a phrase we use at work quite a lot, is it's designed to push the work of climate change mitigation and adaptation into the system, meaning into the different parts of government that have some role in relation to climate change. So we have this notion, which we'll go through, of sectors of the economy that emit greenhouse gas emissions, and this notion that we have ministers who are responsible for those sectors. And there's a tension in that already because we don't have a planned economy. We have a market economy and we have limited levers over which we can lean on or pull on to do this. Yet we have a lot more levers than sometimes we think. So we've got this challenge of trying to make everybody own the challenge of climate change, yet with limited levers and with power distributed between the public sector, the private sector, the states and the Commonwealth. So that makes it complex and it makes it challenging. And so for us to be trying to round up our colleagues across government to understand how we might go about this is part of our work. It hasn't been done before. So that's part of our challenge ahead. So I've done that slide and I'm going to, if it's okay with Stephanie, hand over to some slides on the structure of the Act and some of its key features. Now, I'll introduce my colleague Stephanie Nile, who is the manager of our mainstreaming team in the Climate Change Policy Branch. But more than that, Stephanie was instrumental in implementing the Act, getting it written, getting it into Parliament, getting it passed by Parliament. So Stephanie knows a whole lot more about the Act than I do. And so I'll hand you over to Stephanie right now. Thank you.
Thank you, and apologies.
I'll come back for some more.
Apologies, I've just sprinted from the city, so I might be a little bit puffed. But yes, this is actually quite a scary time for me because we start to see the theoretical framework that we developed attempt to be implemented. And it's sort of a moment of reckoning in that sense. So we'll see how it goes. So before I get into the broad architecture of the Act, there were three key principles that we had in mind when we were devising this, and these came through in the independent review committee's report, and we built on them as we were thinking about what we actually wanted this Act to achieve. And the first one is the idea that obviously we do want it to reduce emissions. Like that would be great. So we got our nice little net zero embedded in legislation, and we got, you know, interim targets and things like that, which will be spoken about a little bit later. So obviously, key priority, we actually want to reduce Victoria's emissions. The second principle that we really, really wanted to emphasise in this structure is that from the lessons learned from the previous iteration of the Climate Change Act and from things we've seen happen federally, the idea that if you want an enduring framework in this space, if you want to mandate action to happen, and this was also drawing from the Paris Agreement and the model set up there, often it's actually about creating a process rather than being really prescriptive about exactly the actions you want to take. Not just because that can sometimes cause a bit of a political backswing or a reaction, but also because you've got to admit, you know, if this Act does what it's intended to do and lasts until 2050, we can't anticipate every single circumstance that's going to arise in the next 30 odd years. So you need some inherent flexibility in there to allow the governments of the day to actually respond to new priorities and new information. So we were trying to create a structure that would give us certainty of action without being overly prescriptive in what it required as well, which was quite an awkward juggle. And the other key factor that we really wanted to sort of express in this Act is that climate change is not the responsibility of the Minister for Climate Change. Climate change is a responsibility of every single minister across government, every single decision maker. So we were looking for interesting mechanisms to try and ensure that that happened and to encourage that to happen. So this is how we came up with the structure as it stands. So obviously the sort of chapeau is this net zero by 2050, the fact that we got to embed that in legislation. Recognising that reacting to climate change is not necessarily just about emissions reduction, it's also about adaptation. There are equity considerations, there's a whole lot of other things as well. We embedded policy objectives which broaden that sort of very narrow emissions focus out to incorporate some other stuff as well, and we'll go into that a little bit later. And the idea that we didn't want absolute flexibility in terms of the pathway there. We want some control over not just the endpoint, but the channel that the government takes. So we also introduced guiding principles, or reinstated, kept them, the guiding principles that were there, just to try and provide a little bit of control without being overly prescriptive about the kind of actions and the kind of thought process that should go into any policy development under this Act. We really tried to entrench this idea of mainstreamed or better decision making through having a very generic duty, which I'll go into a bit later about, you know, everyone needs to consider climate change. And also we maintained a function in the Act called Schedule 1, which we'll also touch on a bit later. To really drive the policy development side of things, we cemented the idea of a 5-yearly climate change strategy, again linked to actions and the processes coming out of the Paris Agreement. And flowing from that, we have sort of 5-yearly emissions reductions pledges and 5-yearly adaptation action plans, where again, the responsibility for those is devolved down to the relevant and appropriate ministers. Just as an aside, we caused conniptions in Parliamentary Council because the word pledge had never been used in Victorian legislation before, and they had a lot of awkward conversations around the water cooler about what this could mean in law, and we're like, it's just a statement of stuff that we're going to do. But yeah, so that this is a world first, pledge in legislation. And then because, again, with this idea of flexibility, it is a soft law mechanism. We are just trying, you know, there's no real sticks in there, but the idea is that the monitoring and reporting, public reporting creates accountability. So there's a lot in there about reporting back to the public, tabling those things in Parliament on the assumption that if that material becomes public, if people are able to hold the government to account, that's more likely to actually increase ambition of action. So that's a broad framework, and elements of that we'll go into in detail later. Going back to that idea of mainstreaming, so our guiding principles, which are, trying to help direct the pathway in a general sense, are all, I mean, they're basically just, best practice ideas, and they incorporate some basic principles of environmental law around the precautionary principle. Be careful what you do. You don't have all the information. Really basic stuff around risk management. We introduce the concept of intergenerational equity and ideas like that, just to make sure that we're trying to direct people's minds in the right way. And then, as I said too, we really started to branch out the policy objectives. So it covers, resilience of infrastructure, trying to sort of ensure that vulnerable communities aren't left behind in the transition, to sort of focus it out a little bit more just from pure emissions reduction. And the interesting thing is the section 20, which is the requirement that climate change be integrated generally into government decision making. It's quite a softly worded obligation. It's, where relevant, should have regard to climate change, if you want to. And it's been quite interesting seeing the impact that it's had across government, because even though it's not a hard stick by any stretch of the imagination, what it does is gives people a mandate. If there's already a desire to do something on climate change, they can now sit there and point to a statutory obligation to allow them to do that. So it's quite empowering in that sense. And we've seen, some really interesting consequences of that. And did you want?
Okay, I think that's back to me. We're having a bit of a chat team here today. So I'm okay, thank you. I will take the pointer. So as Stephanie mentioned, one of the features of the Act is the climate change strategy, which needs to be done every 5 years. And the way I think about it as a relative newcomer to this space is that the Act and the climate change framework that was developed at the same time as that was, if you like, the initial strategy that the government is rolling out now. But this point that this is meant to endure, this framework and this legislation, out to 2050, requires it to be rethought periodically. This is something we could do in state government without legislation, but it is hardwired in here, and the way we bureaucrats behave is, if it's in the Act, you've got to do it. So it does have a real effect on making us think about how we're going to achieve this. It also requires bringing together some of the different parts of activity, or different areas of activity that are going on under the Act. So the pledges and the adaptation action plans and any transition activities that are landed on by the government do need to be brought together. So while there's this devolution of responsibility out across government, the strategy is a way of bringing it together and ensuring it coheres. So that's I guess the purpose there of the climate change strategy, and there's a few more details on how it works there. Emission reduction targets. I'm going to hand to Inga. We're going to jump up and down a little bit more. This is fun. I'll give that to you, and I'll leave it with you.
I'm going to talk about my piece of the puzzle, which is, I guess, the first piece of emissions reductions that the government's undertaking under the Act. The Act, as Michael and Steph have said, it establishes a net zero target by 2050, and then the interim targets are mandated under the Act to provide the pathway for Victoria to get there. So as it says here, the targets are set in advance. They must be informed by an independent expert advice, and the Act requires that each of the targets are lower than the next one, so that there's a continuous downward trajectory. So what we're working on now under the Act is the first 2 of these interim targets for 2021 to 2025, and then 2026 to 2030. As you can see here in the blue, that means that what we're thinking about is the first third of the pathway to 2050, and really picks up from the government's non-legislative target that it already has in place for 2020, which you can see here is 15 to 20% below 2005 levels. And I think we'll talk about later that the projections of where the expectation is at the moment that Victoria will be in 2020. And so this process is required to be completed under the Act by the 31st of March 2020, but we're already underway. Gone backwards. And the first part of that process is the establishment of an independent expert panel, who I have the pleasure of helping with their task. So the panel was established, I think it was almost a year ago, and the members of the panel set out here, chaired by the Honourable Greg Combase, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of from his role in the Commonwealth. Also Dr. Penny Wetton, who is a climate scientist, who used to work at CSIRO, and Dr. Lorraine Stevenson, who has a long history working in the energy and climate change space. So as I said, they've been underway for almost a year. They are required under the Act and their terms of reference from our Minister to provide recommendations on the interim targets, but also to provide advice on trajectories to get to net zero emissions that are associated with those interim targets, and also advice on emissions reduction opportunities. So how might the targets be met? The panel are required to provide their advice to the Minister by the 22nd of February next year, which is not that far off. And I think the panel have gone through quite a big process, very much relying on the principles and objectives of the Act to help them to think through what are all the issues that they need to cover off in coming to conclusions about interim targets. They put out a consultation document at the beginning of this year, which went through some of those issues, and just briefly the kinds of things that touched on, context including climate science and what might be impacts of climate change in Victoria, what's the policy landscape, what are other people doing, what's the international policy landscape, what are already the policies that are in place in Victoria, but then focusing in on kind of, I guess, three key lenses that they're applying to think about the task of setting targets. First of those, the kind of, I guess, top-down one, which is looking at emissions budgets, trying to think through, okay, well, there's an international agreement in the Paris agreement that points us in the direction of certain temperature goals. Those can be translated into amounts of emissions that might be emitted over time, and how does that then translate from a global picture through to Victoria? The second one, focusing on the advice that they need to provide around how might these targets be met, and looking at all the different sectors and what the different changes and technologies that might be applied to reduce emissions. And then finally considering what might be the impacts of reducing emissions on the economy and the community, for businesses, for vulnerable communities. So that process is closed. It would happen at the start of the year, and the panel are now considering that and a range of other advice from experts and from within the government. And as I said, we'll conclude their advice on the 22nd of February, which that advice will then subsequently be tabled in Parliament, and the government will make a decision after that on what the interim targets should be. I think that's me.
Thank you, Inga. So just to go through some of the mechanics in the Act, we have, as I said, this idea, the different ministers and the departments supporting them will go forth and figure out how they're going to reduce emissions in different sectors of the economy. And so the sector pledges, and I'll skip this because this is a relatively minor part of emissions, government emissions, but sector pledges, we've got responsibility devolved to the relevant ministers for waste, land use change and forestry, agriculture, industry, energy, transport and buildings. And so we're working with the different parts of government that actually support those ministers to say, well, what does a pledge look like? There is some guidance in the Act. It says that a pledge is a statement of actions, which in our terms often means policies and programs. What are you going to do in this area over the next five-year period to reduce emissions? The pledge also needs to include an estimate of the emissions reduction that you think those actions will generate. And that's a bit of a challenge when you don't have all the levers in your hand, as I described before. So part of the action might be we will do this ourselves, something that we have control over. And so the things that the government has its hands on, for example, are government procurement. That's a small part of the economy, but it's something we absolutely have our hands on. But there's a whole range of other ways that governments can act to influence behaviour in the market, from incentives to spending money to regulations to influencing the Commonwealth or participating in cooperative measures that go on between the states to try and get outcomes at a Commonwealth level. One of those, for example, is around fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. The state doesn't have its handle on that. It's a large and growing part of our emissions. Vehicles are responsible for the bulk of our transport emissions, yet we don't have our hands on the levers. So what can we do in that space? That's going to be one of the challenges of each of the pledges. How do we understand the emissions? What are some pathways to decarbonisation, and how can we influence that? How can we nudge it? What do we do ourselves? What do we try to influence? What do we advocate for? What might we do differently to that which we're doing now? And I also mentioned, of course, that a hell of a lot of this activity is going on as a result of millions and millions of private decisions within the economy. And so governments aren't alien to that, but as I say, we're often, our culture is to sit back and let the market do what it does. In the absence of that economy-wide carbon price, it's quite challenging to figure out how do we do this? How do we crowd in some of that private sector activity that's already going in the direction that we need it to if we're going to go to net zero emissions? The other part, or another part of the Act that I think is really important, and we perhaps don't focus on necessarily as much in this forum when we're talking about energy transition, hope that's not me, thank you, is around adaptation. So the climate is changing. It's changing in ways that we have some handle on, yet we're still working out a good deal of the rest of that. And that challenge as to what it means for us is with us now. And similarly to the model that we've got in the Act of pushing the work into the system, of figuring out what's happening for a particular sector and planning for those changes, we've done the same for adaptation as we have done for sector pledges. So nominated ministers will be required to prepare adaptation action plans under the Act for key systems that are either vulnerable to climate change impacts or are essential to ensure Victoria is prepared. And the sectors that we've got nominated are the built environment, transport, primary production, health and human services, education and training, natural environment and the water cycle. And they'll be the main tool through which government will drive and facilitate adaptation action planning across Victoria. So part of our role in the system at the hub of this is to bring together all of those different parts of government that have some responsibility for this and help them work out how they're going to do this reasonably consistently with each other and in a way that's going to help them adapt. We've done a couple of pilots of these. The water cycle adaptation action, pilot adaptation action plan was released by the government recently. And it's an example of where the sector has said, what are the range of challenges that the water cycle is going to experience from climate change, and how do we adapt to those? There's been a lot of work in that area in water for a long time, looking at how climate change is going to impact water resource availability. So they're quite well versed in this, but being more comprehensive about how climate change is going to impact on infrastructure as well as resource availability and their services is what you'll find in that adaptation action plan. And I've just talked about the pilot ones. Monitoring and reporting. I think this is a really important part of any regime where if you're posing to the public that you're going to do something, that you have some mechanisms in there about how we monitor and report on progress and what we're doing. And so there are three key pillars to that, and I'm going to get into one of them in a moment, the annual greenhouse gas reporting, which we've just had our first one published this year. There's also a 5-yearly climate science report due out next year, and that's going to be an interesting challenge for what we focus on there, because there's plenty of climate science out there. What do we say about climate science in a way that's relevant to Victoria? Both the science of the atmosphere and the climate and how that's going to impact on the globe, including us, and the science of the biophysical impacts that are going to demand that we adapt. So that's a report that will be prepared and published in 2019. And there's also a report required at the end of each interim target period. So if we set out in our pledges and then we bundle them up in our strategy to say we're going to try and reduce emissions economy-wide by this amount, what did we learn from that? How did we go? There's a mechanism in the Act for actually doing that and structuring that. Now, Victoria's Greenhouse Gas Emissions Report. Who's familiar with it? Has anyone seen it on our website? We'll count the hits this afternoon and see if you go and look at it. Hey, thank you very much. I'm delighted someone down there's seen it. It was released very recently and we haven't really shouted it from the rooftops yet, but I think we will probably as soon as we can. This is the first annual greenhouse gas report that's been published in Victoria. The Commonwealth does a lot of work on greenhouse gas reporting, and a lot of our work has derived from the numbers that come out of the Commonwealth, and we've built on that. I think it's quite amazing that we actually haven't had a state report like this before. So this is really quite a big deal that we've actually got a dedicated report on greenhouse gas emissions in Victoria, which you need, I think, to underpin that idea that the state's got a role in this. If you're actually going to say we've got a role, well, you've got to do your own work to say we know about our emissions, we know where they're coming from. You can't just say, oh, well, that's someone else's job or we'll leave it to the Commonwealth. I'm also really excited by it because it's the first public product under the Climate Change Act, and it's just come out. So that's really exciting for us and the team to say, oh, this thing is working as it's meant to. Because as Stephanie pointed out, there aren't any consequences necessarily other than reputational ones for the government for not doing this. So it's really important that we all take it seriously, which we do, and our governments take it seriously, which they do. So we've got our first report out. And there's some details there that I can skip. What does it show us? And this is something I'm going to dwell on a little bit. We have a little bit of time. Because this is a really important resource for anybody working in climate change policy or energy transition or in any of these issues across the state, because we've got some terrific information here that we can derive some really important insights from to think about where we're going. So if we're at the Energy Transition Hub, this data is really critical to underpin thinking about the energy transition that needs to occur in Victoria to achieve our goals. So to describe this stacked bar chart here, this shows the emissions in Victoria by sector in 2016. That's to the year ending 30 June 2016. And total emissions in that year were 114 million tonnes. I'll show what that looks like against the baseline year of 2005 that's been chosen under the Act, which had emissions of around 127.7 million tonnes. So they're dropping, and we'll talk a bit about why. The big orange part of the bar chart. Now I am going to ask some questions, and I do expect some answers. What's that?
Brown coal.
Brown coal. Thank you. It should be brown, but it's orange. Okay. The red. Well, you're not going to know that. I'll give that one away. That's direct combustion. Okay, so it's burning fossil fuels at home or at work. Yellow is transport. Aquamarine is agriculture. We've got waste in the Navy. Industrial processes are grey. Fugitive emissions are purple. And we've got here the net contributions from land use change and forestry, one of Rebecca's favourite topics, here in the green, which actually reduces our emissions overall. And we've got the shares of emissions over here. So when you look at the task of our ministers who have to figure out how we're going to reduce emissions across the economy, and we look at, for example, the energy minister, the transport minister or ministers, the Agriculture Minister, Industry Minister, they're all represented there with their blocks of emissions, and the task that they have to figure out, it starts there. Clearly the largest sector in Victoria is electricity generation, almost entirely brown coal, around twice the emissions of black coal. So huge part of the Victorian government, the Victorian economy's emissions profile. And if you look at the next two big chunks of emissions, direct combustion and transport, your opportunities to reduce emissions in those sectors rest on reducing emissions in this sector. So if you're going to fuel switch, so energy transition hubbers, if you're going to fuel switch your car, your industry, your house to electricity, this has to be dealt with first. So thinking about it like this starts to combine with work we've done with, for example, Climate Works, or work we've done with this organisation, the Transition Hub, and others, to say, well, how does this pan out? You know? And that's some of the work that we have to do in the absence of that economy-wide carbon price that was a feature of the landscape at one point, that would do a lot of this work for you and avoid a lot of this thinking. In the absence of that, we have to do some of this thinking ourselves. That's okay. We're having a red hot go at it. But we have to try and figure out what is the sequence and what is the way that these things interact if we're going to achieve our mission. So first cab off the rank really is electricity generation. And one thing we do know is that that transition is underway. This is 2016 data. Early in 2017, Hazelwood coal-fired power station dropped out and reduced this emissions bar already. So we can see that happening, but how that is shaped in the future and then how it can feed back into direct combustion and transport is another question. Rebecca's reminding me that we're almost at time for questions. I'm going to gallop through a couple of slides on emissions just to show you a couple of other features, and then we'll pause, we'll set up here and we'll take your questions, which we may or may not answer. So Victoria's historic emissions, there they are back to 1990. Baseline for the Act chosen in 2005. This is what they are to date, and this is some projections out to 2020. The government has a target of 15 to 20% less emissions in 2020 compared to the 2005 baseline. Our projection suggests that they'll be within that range at about 18.2%. Victoria is responsible for a bit over a fifth of the national emissions, so our emissions count, as do every other jurisdiction, especially if you need to get to zero. And finally, the graph here, this is really important, I think, just to understand. If you look at, in this graph, gross state product in the navy blue bar chart keeps going up. Greenhouse gas emissions in the aquamarine line bumped around, started to go down. Here's that displayed in another way. This is an important concept, particularly for our Treasury colleagues, to understand that economic growth in Victoria has become decoupled from greenhouse gas emissions, as it has in a lot of advanced economies. And this is a really important feature to understand, that this decoupling can happen without interfering with this. And so I'll leave it on that. And do I hand back to you, Rebecca? And do I take my seat?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. So you can only hand back to me for me to invite you all to come up here and to invite questions. And I think we have some, yes, exactly. Good. We have some roving microphones, and we would appreciate people trying to use them, so that, because we're recording the session, and it helps pick up the questions as well. But I'll pass this one now over to you, so you can also do the same.
Hello, Anita Foster at Melbourne Law School. Hi. I'm interested in, when you're, I guess, the relationship between what you know about where emissions come from across the sectors in Victoria, and then the process for setting pledges and the target. So how, you know, what kind of framing and parameters are placed on the setting of pledges for particular sectors to reflect the contributions that they can make more easily than other sectors?
So I guess if I start off in terms of targets, that data about where emissions come from is a very important first place to start thinking, and certainly something the panels looked very closely at, and then that leads into thinking about, okay, well, if you've got those emissions from those sectors, what are the technologies, what are the changes, what are the things we can apply to then reduce emissions, and that feeds into their thinking around, well, how can you reduce emissions and how much can you reduce emissions? So it's that kind of bottom-up look.
Going back to the Independent Review Committee, it was certainly their philosophy when they were discussing the interrelationship between those things, that recognising that a lot of the levers to reach the emissions reduction targets will be outside Victoria, but what they wanted to do was make sure that the conversation was being had around the cabinet table in government about, I think Anna Scarbeck always referred to it as the gap. So if people added up their emissions and there was a gap, you would have this very concentrated discussion around the cabinet table about what to do about the gap. So again, it came back to the idea of transparency and just making sure the conversation was being had at the appropriate levels at the appropriate time. And so that was certainly the Independent Reviews Committee approach to that issue.
Just to add to that, Anita, the relationship between the targets and pledges is something that's really, I guess, still being debated and worked out. The sequencing in the Act really says targets first. You've got to know where you're going, have something to aim for, and that they need to then drive your activity. The independent expert panel is very clear that it's not making recommendations with regards to policy. Policies belong to government, and it's not making recommendations about that. But it's also concerned that what it's recommending is achievable. So there's a real tension there and a real grey area between, well, how much can we know about it being achievable if we don't think about policies to achieve it? So that's part of the discussion. Then there's the question of what if your pledges don't add up to your targets, and what if there's the gap? So they don't necessarily have to, but if there is a gap, you need to figure out how you go about filling the gap.
And again, that was sort of foreshadowed by the structure of the Act too. When we talk about that interim target period report, the obligation in the Act isn't that you have to meet the interim targets. It's that if you do not, you need to have a very big description in that report about why that was. Again, to sort of keep the transparency up, to keep the conversation going, and hopefully sort of found stronger action in the future. So that's sort of the philosophy behind it.
No, the microphone's coming.
Brindella from Energy Makeovers. At the end of the day, the key to avoiding dangerous climate change is effective global governance. The work that you're doing in Victoria, Victoria is leading the world. I mean, when I look around the world, I don't see many laws that match Paris. Do you have plans for how do you feed the good work that you're doing into the global system so that it plays a role or a contribution towards that effective global movement?
Yeah, sure. It's a really great question because it begs the other question: who is responsible? And what we're seeing is that everyone's responsible and no one's responsible. And so where do you go from there? And Victoria's taken the position that we want to be responsible for our fair share of emissions and take action on that. We're not alone, and that's a great thing. There is a club, or a gang, if you like, of subnational governments called the Under 2 Coalition. And they had I'm trying to remember what it's called, a jamboree of some description in San Francisco recently, which was hosted by the Californian Governor, Jerry Brown. And there were jurisdictions from all sorts of places there, from European subnational governments, the US, Canada, Brazil, other South American nations, Australia. There were a whole host of subnational governments that came together there to say, we're taking some responsibility for this. Let's share what we're doing. And that's also was timed to be prior to the Convention of Parties in Poland in December next month, to get governments focused on what we might achieve out of that process. I wasn't there. My executive director, Kath Rowley, was there. So she was there representing Australia, There were representatives representing Victoria. Whoops, that was a mistake. Representing Australia. She was there representing Victoria. There were people there from South Australia, Queensland as well. So there's quite a lot of activity going on there. And it's a really interesting question about the relationship between and the role of subnational governments in international, what is an international effort.
And you'll be going to the COP meetings?
No, we won't be going to the COP meetings. It is something that we do leave to the national government there, because that is a thing for national governments. There will be loads of people from different parts of Victoria, industry or industry groups, for example, that will be there, which we'll be hearing all about, but no, we won't be there.
Hi.
The woman with the microphone.
Susan Quinn, Victorian Council of Social Service. I think, Stephanie, you mentioned there are some equity considerations in adaptation plans. I was wondering what those are and how they're being implemented so far.
So the equity considerations apply to the whole Act. They're embodied in the principles that are meant to underpin all the policy actions that are taken under the Act. So exactly how those are going to be expressed, still to be determined. Obviously, it's a very, very complex space, but that will be, that's going to be sort of part of the process, is working out how that feeds in, what the role is. But the idea is that what the Act makes clear is that that needs to be a fundamental focus of any of the work that happens, whether it's the adaptation action plans or the sector pledges as well. So.
Tobias Geiger from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research in Germany. You mentioned that you have the science report coming out in 2019, and there might, I'm not fully aware of the scientific literature concerned with Victoria, but there might not be so much research going on that is sufficient to basically grasp the whole landscape. I was kind of wondering, are you also supporting that process with grants, for example, to make a progress in this scientific field?
Sure. So the main area of activity that the Victorian government specifically invests in terms of generating scientific data about climate change impacts in Victoria, is through a project with CSIRO, our main Commonwealth government scientific organisation. And the investment in that is to understand at a smaller and smaller scale the likely impacts of climate change across Victoria. Now, this sort of work has been carried out in different ways for quite a long time. I previously worked in our water sector, where we had worked with the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO to downscale to catchments the likely impacts of climate change, both the warming trend and the drying trend and the rainfall pattern trend, to say, what are we likely to experience in terms of water yield from this catchment over time in the future? So there are elements of that work that have gone on in different sectors. The key thing that we're investing in right now is that work to downscale from larger models to, I think it's a 5 by 5 kilometre grid. So really quite fine scaled data for what the likely impact is on Victoria. It's still going to give you bands, but it's going to come down to that scale. That's the sort of thing that's meant to be useful for, in particular, for agricultural industries or anyone else who's reliant on what's actually going on in their climate. So that work's happening. That will be reflected in that science report, and that's what is absolutely Victoria specific. In terms of other science about the global atmosphere, well, we'll draw on other sources rather than be investing in our own science.
Thank you so much. And I would have myself hundreds of questions, but we have one online question here. Peter Kent, can you hear us? Your time to ask one question of the 10 you asked online. Peter? No, doesn't work. Okay. Okay. One more. How many more questions?
I think we have time for about one more. Hi, my name's Anna Mallard. I'm with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Article 12 of the Paris Agreement covers action for climate empowerment, which encompasses education, training, public awareness. I'm just wondering if any part of the Act covers covers these topics, or if there's sort of plans in the future to do so.
We thought that was the Commonwealth's responsibility. Didn't we leave that?
The Act is very focused on the policy process, setting up a strong policy process within and a framework for that to happen within the state government. You can see how, again, going back to the idea that any particular prescription would be sort of reviewing the evidence of the day and the needs of the day. You can see that there could definitely, particularly we've got some specific requirements around education and training, something like that could fall out of it. But as I said, it is sort of setting the broad overarching framework to allow stuff like that to come out. There's also the opportunity for individuals and local councils and people like that to pledge action too, and they could be around education as well as sort of actual concrete emissions reductions activities as well. So there's scope, but yeah, it depends on the priorities of the government of the day. That was a very bureaucratic answer.
You understood. Good.
Okay, so in the interest of keeping it to time, because I'm aware many people will have other commitments, we will close it off now. I'm sure there are many, many questions that a lot of people would have and love to put to you. But I just really want to thank you for coming down and talking to us. It is amazing work that's going on in Victoria, and it's extremely exciting to have a Climate Change Act that we do, the Climate Change Act that we do have in the state. Particularly, I think there's a lot of focus on federal action, and it's important to note what is happening at a state level, and having it in legislation is a remarkable thing. And we are also aware of the difficult circumstances in which you find yourselves in Caretaker Mode and talking about this issue in particular. So thank you very much for coming down. And I reiterate the statement you made at the start as well, Michael, about how the research community, industry and individuals also, the whole frame of the legislation, as you say, in Victoria is very much around a whole host of action coming together from a range of parties. So it's a great way to leave it, to put that question to others to see what they can bring forward to the debate as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.